I knew you guys were thinking that you wanted to have a lecture on Satan. So, in the middle of a retreat about awakening, um, I could see it. I could just tell. So, um, so someone mentioned that in Hebrew the word Satan means resistance, or the one that resists. It's not a necessarily an embodied figure who was cast out of heaven and um, lives in a domain called hell and all that. I looked it up briefly to make sure that I wasn't given a black pearl. Turns out to be true. And I'm not a scholar on this at all, and I haven't read that much on it, but I can give you a little bit of information and then relate it to my own insight. According to what I read, the word was only used like 18 times in the Old Testament, when the Old Testament's very big, so that's relatively few mentions. And several of them were in the book of Job. And apparently the first time, or the earlier mentions of it in Job, were references more to sort of like a faculty in the way Job is processing, rather than something sent by God or some kind of entity or anything like that. And then later mentions it was more like a messenger from God. Again, not a like cast out entity or demon or anything, but a sort of maybe you could say a strategy of God to tempt Job, or to set up this this challenge for him by interpretation of it. But I think it's really interesting because this lines up really well with the evolution of our understanding of suffering. Early on, it's often surprising. When I say early on, I mean when people are first exposed to this talk about awakening and realization. It's often surprising how little insight people have, at least as far as whether they suffer. I've had people outright just say, well, I don't suffer. I don't even know what you mean by that, right? And I've reflected on that, trying to figure out why someone would say that, to what degree they actually believe it, and to what degree it's more just a front, or a persona, part built into the persona of trying to convince others you feel good when you don't, and so forth. But I think it's pretty intertwined with identity, actually. We get so in our head, as I mentioned in a previous talk, we get so intertwined with thought and the conditioned patterns of thought, that we don't even realize the degree to which we're being run by thought, by like a puppet, which strongly includes our processing of theory of mind. I mean, theory of mind meaning our awareness of another person's internal world, and then our nearly constant when we're with somebody, or probably constant, and even when we're not with people, pretty ongoing interface with what we perceive to be the mind of others, even the collective mind of others, which would mean something like public opinion, the world's view of us. And we identify so much with that often we spend a lot of our lives or a lot of our free time upholding or reinforcing that persona, which is really several layers superficial to who we actually are, what we actually want, or what's actually going on. But it seems to have a certain currency to it, social currency and so forth. So if this sounds too abstract to anyone, I'm sure it doesn't in here, but anyone listening, just look at social media. Just watch what happens. People posting, look how happy I am, look how great my kids are, look how smart my kids are, look how all of it, right? How wealthy I am, all the stuff I have, look at the new thing I bought, look how clever I am, all of it, right? But you could ask, you could stop and go, why do that? Does it actually help? What does it do for us? Sure, it makes other people a little jealous of you. Sure. Does that help you? Makes people feel competitive, but sort of in a bit of a hidden way, in the same hidden way that you're bragging, right? So this stuff goes on. It's prevalent, right? It's very, very common. But I think that is a symptom of what I'm talking about. Like we don't even stop to think of like, well, what else could I be doing aside from what everyone else is doing, right? It becomes competitiveness with what you own, keeping up with the Joneses and all that sort of thing. But it's also why we do a lot of what we do, why we drink what we drink, eat what we eat, act the way we do, dress the way we do, social conditioning. A lot of it's benign, it doesn't really matter, but some of it's surprising. A very spiritual example is the 90s mom jeans. Why did those come back now? Those were never attractive. Why don't these kids know that? They weren't attractive then. They're definitely not now. So I don't get it, right? Or, or camp. Camp is like, as defined by The Simpsons, the absurdly, what was it? Absurdly ironic or ironically absurd, something like that. So like, what's the example? Hipsters, like the hipster style at least, right? Looking like your dad did in the 70s, cut off shorts, beard, dark glasses, walking around with a Polaroid, right? Drinking PBR. But what happens is when you drink, you don't realize, like when I was in high school, that was like crappy beer, right? And when you couldn't afford the Budweiser, you get PBR, you get Old Milwaukee or Milwaukee's Best. But it became kitsch or like camp to where people were drinking it almost like as a joke, like tongue in cheek. But then it became so common, people actually thought it was good again. It was like, no, it wasn't ever really good. You just believed your own joke, right? Anyway, I'm being kind of silly, but if you look at style and trends of style, it's sort of like that as well, right? That's just a symptom of what I'm talking about. But underneath it, there's this pervasive and surprisingly compelling tendency and need to do what other people do, to impress people, to we do it with everything. We do it with our kids, we do it with ourselves, with our image, with our bodies, with our everything, right? What we own. But that is already making an assumption. I think if you look deeply enough, you're already making an assumption that's based on a belief about yourself that you're not happy really, fundamentally. So the next best thing is to convince other people you are. And as silly as that is, it's tragic that we spend that much energy doing it, right? But again, when identity is built into that, when identity is built into the constant projection of a persona that seems to be socially endorsed, at least right now, and that can even be stressful, right? Because that changes. What's socially endorsed changes, right? Especially if you're political, right? If you're really liberal or really conservative, what you're pissed off about changes so frequently, you have to really keep up with that by watching the right news source, right? Let it be fed to you. Here's what you're mad about now. No. Here's what you're mad about now, right? So it takes a lot of energy to keep our finger on the pulse of that constantly moving and completely insane social matrix. What a waste of time, right? And yet we do it. I guess, yeah, it's okay to say this publicly. I was trying to think of whether it's nothing really in particular, I guess, as far as identifiable. But I remember I was giving a talk to like a group of people, a good-sized group of people, and I was talking about suffering. And I remember one person said to the group that they knew the group well. They said, "Do you guys understand this thing about suffering? Do you relate to that? Like, do you feel like you suffer? Because I don't at all." And one of the people said that, and they seemed completely authentic. They didn't seem like they were blowing smoke. They seemed completely authentic. And then a couple of the people said, a lot of them didn't answer. A couple of people were like, "Oh, for sure, that's why I'm interested in this topic, a spiritual topic." Like when I finally realized how much I was suffering. And anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting, but I wasn't terribly surprised because, again, if you were to just give this talk to a group of 100 people who had no idea what the talk was about and had no indoctrination into this type of stuff, probably a lot of them would think like, what's this suffering thing you're talking about? Sounds like some ancient Buddhist thing or something. Like, I don't suffer. But what was interesting is the same person, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes later, talking about a different topic, casually mentioned, he's like, last week when I was seeing my therapist, blah, 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 blah. No, that's not the funny part. Funny part is he's been seeing his therapist for 30, did he say 30 or 40 years? Yeah, and my jaw like dropped. It was so hard not to say anything because I didn't want to be like like, But I kind of paused and I was like, I wonder if that registered for him. I don't think it registered at all. It's like, you need a therapist to talk to weekly for 30 or 40 years, but you don't think you're suffering. Why are you doing that then? Right? Anyway, again, just a simple example, but the first stage of realization, as I described in my series on the ox herding pictures, the first ox herding picture, which is a stage, and the stage is realizing you suffer, that you actually, it's authenticity. First stage is authenticity. When you stop sucking on the teat of social conditioning and social approval and so forth, long enough. I mean, you're still sucking on it, but long enough so a couple of the drips drop away and you can like rub your chin and think about it for a minute. Oh, that is why I am pretty competitive. I do, post on social media like 9 hours a day. Maybe there's something to this, right? Once you do that, once you've gone through that stage but it kind of sucks because what happens then is it's like you open the door and it really comes in. You're like, fuck, I am really suffering. Then it surprises you, right? Then you're like, sometimes you don't even relate it to this process we're talking about, that you had some opening, or maybe you took some, I don't know, DMT or some shit, but you had a real opening, and then feels so vast and amazing and connected and interconnected. And you run around trying to be the local guru and tell everybody how asleep they are and that you're awake now. But then it's followed by this intense emotional stuff, right? Really intense emotion of fear or dread, or like, fuck, where did this come from? That's what it means to realize that first stage, I would say, is like the first noble truth of Buddhism. Life is suffering. Doesn't mean it has to be suffering. Doesn't mean it's constant suffering, but a certain level of authenticity comes online where you're like, damn, like I'm really hurt, like underneath all of the bullshit, underneath all of the layer after layer of internal identity, constantly bouncing back and forth in my mind, and thoughts, and then the external, where I bounce it off people all day long that help me go into complicity. When I stop doing that long enough, I'm really miserable. And so that's important. That's an important insight. Perhaps you could say that's the first case of Satan with Job. It's something that you just discover in yourself. Then you might say, well, why would God actually send that to you? Right? Why would God send suffering to you? Why would God send resistance to you, or the one who resists to you? Why would that? That doesn't make sense, does it? But it actually does make sense. But it takes a long time along this path, I think, a lot of insight to really get to this different understanding of suffering. That as much as it sucks, as much as it drives our whole process to want deeper insight, to wake up from suffering, without it, I'm not sure this process would propagate for most people. So it actually turns out to, let's say, use the word divine, because we're talking about biblically, turns out to be quite divine. It turns out to be very important. As miserable as it is to the human, as miserable it is to the seeming individual, it's miserable because it's burning up that seeming individual, the thing that feels like it's separate from everything, the thing that feels like it needs to manage everything in the world and its life, and gets confused about what's internal and external, and is addicted to struggle with thoughts, struggle with emotions, struggle with other people, struggle with the world. It's addicted to struggle.